Those early experiences of being ignored or bullied shape us, creating a deep wound.
Childhood rejection doesn't always look dramatic. It isn't always abuse, abandonment, or cruelty that outsiders can easily identify. Sometimes it's subtle, being overlooked, being compared, being tolerated instead of chosen, being loved conditionally based on performance, obedience, or usefulness. For a child, these experiences don't register as rejection. They register as truth. This is how the world works. This is who I am. When rejection happens early, the nervous system adapts around it. The child learns to stay alert, to scan faces, tones, and moods for signs of approval or withdrawal. Love becomes something that can disappear without warning. Safety becomes something that must be earned. Over time, this creates an internal rule that follows the child into adulthood. Connection is fragile, and I am the variable. Adults still healing from childhood rejection often don't identify themselves as wounded. They see themselves as independent, self-reliant, or emotionally strong. But underneath that strength is vigilance. They work harder in relationships. They overthink conversations. They replay moments where they might have said the wrong thing. Their mind isn't dramatic, it's protective. Psychologically, rejection in childhood shapes identity before identity is fully formed. Instead of developing a stable sense of self, the child develops a responsive one. Who do I need to be right now to stay accepted? This flexibility may look like emotional intelligence later in life, but it often comes at the cost of authenticity. The adult becomes skilled at adapting, but unsure of who they are when no one is watching. One of the most painful effects is the internalization of rejection. When something goes wrong, the question isn't what happened, it's what's wrong with me. This reflexive self-blame isn't low self-esteem. It's a learned survival strategy. If the problem is me, then maybe I can fix it. If the problem is others, then I'm powerless. This is why adults healing from childhood rejection often struggle with self-compassion. Kindness toward the self feels unsafe. Harshness feels familiar. They push themselves harder than necessary, believing that rest must be earned and love must be justified. Even success doesn't fully quiet the wound. Achievements bring temporary relief, but the underlying fear remains. What if they find out I'm not enough? What if this acceptance is temporary too? The nervous system doesn't respond to logic. It responds to memory. In relationships, childhood rejection often shows up as emotional hyper-awareness. These adults can sense shifts in energy instantly. A delayed reply, a shorter tone, a distracted look. Their body reacts before their mind does. Anxiety rises, not because something is wrong, but because something once was. Some respond by becoming overly accommodating. They anticipate needs. They avoid conflict. They smooth over tension before it fully forms. Others respond in the opposite way. They withdraw. They keep emotional distance. They leave before they can be left. Both patterns come from the same place, the fear of being unwanted again. Trust becomes complicated, not because they don't want connection, but because closeness activates old questions. How long before this changes? How long before I disappoint them? Love feels good, but it also feels dangerous. This creates an exhausting push-pull dynamic, wanting closeness while bracing for loss. Another common pattern is emotional self-containment. Adults who experienced rejection early often learned not to express needs. Needs were ignored, minimized, or punished. So they learned to need less, or at least to appear that way. They become the strong one, the listener, the supporter. And later, they wonder why no one shows up for them the same way. Psychologically, this creates loneliness even in connection. They may have friends, partners, or families, yet still feel unseen. Not because others don't care, but because they don't fully let themselves be known. Visibility once felt dangerous. Hiding felt safer. Healing begins slowly and rarely where people expect. It doesn't start with forgiving the past or confronting parents. It starts with noticing patterns without judgment, realizing that these behaviors once protected you. They kept you connected when connection felt uncertain. As adults, the work becomes separating past from present, teaching the nervous system that today's relationships are not yesterday's ones. That rejection is no longer inevitable. That worth is not conditional. This process is uncomfortable because it requires staying present during moments of uncertainty instead of reacting automatically. It requires allowing discomfort without self-attack. It requires learning that being imperfect does not equal being unlovable. Adults still healing from childhood rejection aren't broken. They're adaptive. They learned how to survive emotional unpredictability. Healing isn't about erasing the past. It's about updating the system that was built to survive it. As adulthood progresses, the effects of childhood rejection often become more subtle but more complex. These adults may function well externally. They work, maintain relationships, and appear emotionally intelligent. But internally, there is often a persistent sense of being slightly out of place, as if they are always auditioning for belonging rather than inhabiting it. One of the most common internal experiences is emotional doubt. When someone shows care, appreciation, or love, it doesn't land fully. The mind searches for hidden conditions. What do they want? How long will this last? What happens when I disappoint them? Compliments feel nice but unstable, like they could be revoked at any moment. This creates a strange contradiction. These adults crave reassurance, yet reassurance rarely satisfies them. No amount of external validation can override an internal belief that was formed before logic had a voice. The nervous system learned rejection before the brain learned reasoning. Many adults healing from childhood rejection struggle with boundaries. Saying no feels risky. Expressing preferences feels selfish. They learned early that taking up space could cost them connection. So they shrink slightly in relationships, even when they're loved. They wait to be invited instead of choosing. They ask for less than they need. Over time, this self-minimization leads to resentment. Not loud resentment, but quiet fatigue. They give generously, but feel unseen. They support others, but feel unsupported. They wonder why relationships feel draining instead of nourishing, without realizing how much of themselves they're withholding. Another psychological pattern is perfectionism. If rejection came from criticism, comparison, or conditional love, the child learned that mistakes are dangerous. As an adult, this shows up as overpreparation, fear of failure, and difficulty starting. The pressure to get it right becomes paralyzing. Trying feels safer than finishing. Emotionally, this creates chronic tension. The body stays slightly braced, even during calm moments. Rest feels unfamiliar. Joy feels temporary. There is often a belief that something will go wrong once things feel good. This isn't pessimism, it's conditioning. The mind also tends to rewrite the past in self-blaming ways. Maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I expected too much. This reinterpretation protects attachment to caregivers, but sacrifices self-trust. Healing requires gently reclaiming the truth that your needs were real, even if they weren't met. One of the deepest wounds of childhood rejection is the confusion between love and effort. Many adults learned that love requires constant work. You must be useful, pleasant, impressive, or emotionally low maintenance to stay accepted. As a result, rest feels undeserved and being loved as you are feels suspicious. This belief often drives overachievement or chronic people-pleasing, not because success or kindness are bad, but because they're fueled by fear rather than choice. When approval becomes a survival need, authenticity becomes optional. These adults may also struggle with emotional expression. Vulnerability feels exposing. Asking for help feels humiliating. They may intellectually understand that it's okay to need support, but emotionally, it feels dangerous. Their body remembers what happened last time they needed too much. Psychologically, this creates a split. The outer self is capable, composed, and reliable. The inner self feels younger, unsure, and still waiting to be chosen. When stress increases, the inner self takes over. Emotional reactions feel disproportionate. Shame appears quickly. The adult wonders why they're reacting like a child, but that's exactly what's happening. Old emotional memory is being activated. Healing requires meeting that younger part with the safety it never had, instead of criticizing it for existing. Another pattern is difficulty trusting one's own perceptions. When rejection happened without explanation, the child learned that their feelings weren't reliable. As an adult, they second-guess instincts. They look to others for confirmation. They doubt their right to feel hurt, disappointed, or angry. This self-doubt keeps the healing process slow, but not impossible. Awareness is the first shift. Noticing when reactions belong to the past instead of the present. Pausing before self-blame. Asking different questions, not, "What's wrong with me?" but "What is this reminding me of?" Healing doesn't mean becoming fearless in relationships. It means becoming honest with yourself. It means learning that closeness doesn't require erasing your needs. That rejection, while painful, is survivable. And that being unseen once doesn't mean you're unseeable now. Adults still healing from childhood rejection are not behind. They are doing deep internal work that often goes unnoticed. And that work, slowly and quietly, changes how love is experienced from the inside out. As healing deepens, many adults begin to notice grief underneath their patterns. Not just grief for what happened, but grief for what never did. The comfort they didn't receive. The protection they didn't feel. The version of themselves that might have existed if rejection hadn't shaped their nervous system so early. This grief often arrives quietly, in moments of stillness, rather than dramatic breakdowns. This is why slowing down can feel destabilizing. When life becomes less demanding, the emotional backlog surfaces. The mind is no longer busy proving worth or earning safety, so the body finally speaks. Sadness, anger, and longing emerge without a clear present cause. This doesn't mean healing is failing. It means it's finally possible. Many adults at this stage feel conflicted toward their caregivers. They may understand the limitations, trauma, or stress their parents faced, yet still feel hurt. This internal conflict creates guilt. Am I allowed to feel this way? But healing doesn't require choosing sides. It allows complexity. Someone can have done their best and still cause harm. Another shift occurs in how rejection is perceived in the present. Small disappointments no longer feel like confirmations of worthlessness, but they still sting deeply. The difference is subtle but important. Pain is felt without immediately becoming identity. This is emotional growth. These adults may start experimenting with being more visible, sharing opinions, expressing needs, saying no. At first, this feels unnatural and risky. There is often fear that asserting the self will lead to abandonment. But when rejection doesn't occur, or when connection survives honesty, the nervous system slowly updates. Healing also involves redefining belonging. Instead of seeking acceptance everywhere, these adults begin to choose environments where they don't have to perform, where their presence is enough. This discernment can feel lonely at first, because fewer spaces meet that standard. But the connections that remain feel more grounding. Self-compassion becomes a practice, not a feeling. There are setbacks. Old patterns return under stress. The difference is that they're noticed sooner and held with less shame. Healing isn't linear. It spirals. Each return brings more awareness than the last. Set 6, one of the most important milestones in healing from childhood rejection, is developing an internal sense of safety. This doesn't mean life feels easy. It means the body no longer treats every relational shift as a threat. Calm becomes more accessible. Not constant, but possible. As this internal safety grows, boundaries become clearer. Not rigid, but honest. These adults begin to recognize when something doesn't feel right without immediately questioning themselves. They trust discomfort as information rather than weakness. This restores self-trust, which rejection once eroded. Relationships begin to change as well. They attract people who are emotionally available rather than familiar. At first, this can feel boring or unsettling because chaos once felt like connection. Stability requires adjustment. It asks the nervous system to rest instead of brace. Another change is the ability to tolerate disappointment without collapsing inward. When something ends or doesn't work out, it still hurts. But it no longer rewrites the entire self-narrative. Rejection becomes an event, not a verdict. Healing also reshapes ambition. Goals become aligned with values instead of approval. Success feels meaningful rather than compensatory. Failure feels disappointing rather than devastating. The self is no longer constantly on trial. Perhaps the most profound shift is the reclaiming of choice. As children, these adults adapted to survive. As adults, they can choose differently. They can choose relationships that feel reciprocal. They can choose rest without guilt. They can choose authenticity even when it risks disapproval. Childhood rejection leaves marks, but it doesn't define the future. Healing doesn't erase sensitivity. It refines it. What once scanned for danger begins to scan for truth. What once feared abandonment begins to trust presence. Adults still healing from childhood rejection aren't late to life. They are arriving with awareness. And awareness, though earned painfully, creates a depth of connection that is both rare and real. As healing continues, many adults begin to notice a subtle shift in how they experience closeness. They no longer feel the same urgency to secure attachment, but they also don't feel completely relaxed yet. This in-between stage can feel confusing. You're no longer desperate for approval, but you're not fully confident in being accepted either. This liminal space is uncomfortable, but it's a sign of change. At this stage, loneliness can feel sharper. Not because there are fewer people around, but because you're no longer numbing yourself to emotional absence. When you stop overgiving, overperforming, or over-adapting, some connections naturally weaken. This isn't rejection repeating itself. It's misalignment revealing itself. Still, the nervous system may interpret the distance as danger before the mind can understand it. Many adults here struggle with guilt for choosing themselves. Prioritizing your needs may feel selfish, even when it's healthy. This guilt isn't moral. It's conditioned. As a child, self-expression may have threatened connection. As an adult, that same expression is what makes real connection possible. Another pattern that emerges is grief for lost time. You may look back and realize how many decisions were shaped by fear of rejection rather than desire. Careers chosen to please. Relationships maintained out of obligation. Parts of yourself kept quiet to stay acceptable. This realization can feel heavy, but it also brings clarity. You finally see the cost of survival mode. Emotionally, anger may surface more clearly now. Not explosive anger, but a grounded recognition of injustice. This anger is often directed inward at first, then slowly outward in healthier ways. It's not about blame. It's about acknowledging that something real was lost, and that loss mattered. As this happens, emotional honesty deepens. You stop explaining your feelings away. You stop minimizing pain to protect others. You learn that your experience doesn't need permission to be valid. This is a crucial step in repairing self-trust. Healing at this stage is less about understanding and more about embodiment. The body learns through repetition that closeness doesn't require disappearance. That conflict doesn't equal abandonment. That being seen doesn't always lead to being rejected. Set 8. With continued awareness, adults healing from childhood rejection often begin to redefine intimacy. Intimacy becomes less about being needed and more about being known. This shift can feel strange at first because usefulness once felt like safety. Simply existing without proving value feels exposed. You may notice that you're less drawn to emotionally unavailable people. What once felt exciting now feels exhausting. Your nervous system starts craving steadiness instead of intensity. This isn't settling, it's regulation. Another important change is how you respond to mistakes. When rejection shaped your early life, mistakes felt dangerous. Now, mistakes become informative rather than threatening. You learn that repair is possible. That misunderstanding doesn't automatically mean loss. This reduces chronic self-monitoring. At this point, boundaries become more intuitive. You don't over-explain. You don't justify your limits. You trust that people who care will adapt, and those who don't are never truly safe. This discernment brings peace, even when it brings distance. Emotionally, there is more room for joy, but it's quieter. Less performative, more embodied. Joy doesn't need an audience. It arrives in moments of alignment, not approval. You also begin to integrate the past rather than fight it. Childhood rejection becomes part of your story, not the headline. It informs your empathy, your depth, your sensitivity, but it no longer dictates your worth. The nervous system slowly learns a new truth. Connection doesn't have to be earned through self-erasure. Love doesn't require constant vigilance. Belonging doesn't mean disappearing. Adults healing from childhood rejection aren't trying to become someone new. They're uncovering who they were before rejection taught them to hide. And that process, while slow and uneven, creates a form of emotional strength that is deeply rooted and quietly unshakable. As the healing matures, many adults reach a point where they stop trying to fix themselves. They realize they were never broken. What needed repair was not their personality, but the conditions under which it was formed. This realization is quiet but deeply stabilizing. The constant self-improvement urgency softens. At this stage, self-worth becomes less reactive. Praise feels nice, but it no longer defines identity. Criticism may sting, but it doesn't collapse the self. The emotional range stabilizes because worth is no longer being negotiated moment by moment. These adults also become more selective with their energy. They stop chasing connection that feels uncertain. They stop explaining themselves to people who are committed to misunderstanding them. This isn't bitterness. It's clarity. Rejection loses its power when you're no longer seeking validation from unsafe sources. There is also a growing capacity to stay present during discomfort. When conflict arises, the impulse to disappear weakens. When closeness deepens, the urge to sabotage fades. The nervous system learns that intensity doesn't always lead to loss. Another important shift is grief transforming into integration. The pain of childhood rejection doesn't vanish, but it no longer demands constant attention. It becomes part of emotional memory rather than emotional control. This frees up energy for creativity, curiosity, and growth. Many adults at this stage begin to feel compassion for their younger self. Not pity, but respect. They recognize the intelligence it took to survive emotional unpredictability. This reframing replaces shame with dignity. Healing now feels less like work and more like alignment. Choices feel simpler. Relationships feel cleaner. Life feels less like a test and more like a process. The final stage of healing from childhood rejection is not perfection. It's permission. Permission to be human without performance. Permission to be loved without earning it. Permission to walk away from spaces that require self-erasure. Adults who reach this stage often realize something profound. The pain that once made them hyper-aware also made them deeply perceptive. Their sensitivity becomes a strength rather than a liability. They notice nuance. They listen deeply. They connect meaningfully. Rejection, once feared, becomes survivable. Not because it no longer hurts, but because it no longer defines. The self remains intact even when relationships change. This is where genuine self-trust forms. Not the loud confidence of certainty, but the quiet confidence of resilience. You know you can handle disappointment. You know you can recover. You know you don't need to abandon yourself to stay connected. Love, at this point, feels different, less urgent, less consuming, more mutual, more spacious. It allows room for difference without threat. Childhood rejection doesn't disappear from the story, but it stops being the narrator. It becomes a chapter that explains depth, not deficiency. Adults still healing from childhood rejection aren't late. They are doing work many never attempt. They are breaking cycles instead of repeating them. And while that path is often lonely, it leads to a form of wholeness that is earned, embodied, and real.